point? Okay. So I'm going to share the Mishnah just to bring one or two nuanced factors to you guys about what is going on. Okay. Now, one of the issues that's going on is if you look at this case, the first issue is that there's a reciprocal penalty because when two witnesses are found to be conspiring witnesses, Eidim Zomimim, then generally what's the punishment is what they intended to do to the victim is done to themselves. And therefore, if they've sought to cost his fellow 200 zuz, then they are made to pay the reciprocal penalty of 200 zuz. That's the general consensus. Rabbi Meir is saying that, look, there were two violations here. The one was they shall not bear false witness against their neighbor, which is in Shemot chapter 20, verse 13. And then the reciprocal penalty for Eidim Zomimim, which is Deuteronomy Devarim chapter 19, verse 19. And you shall do to him as he planned to do to his brother, meaning there's a reciprocal penalty. So there's both Makkos for the bearing false witness, which is the 9th commandment, as well as the case of the reciprocal penalty that the Eidim Zomimim have to pay. What, guys? You know that they have to pay the what they intended to do. The second case in the Mishnah is a little bit more tricky. And where that's tricky is it's one punishment. They're not two punishments. But we apply the punishment twice, one for the transgression of bearing false witness, and the other penalty is where the exact nature of what they intended to do to the victim is done to them. So what do we know here? Is we know where there's a case where they accused their fellow Jew in the witness box of having transgressed a negative commandment, then that obviously gets lashes to the defendant if they're not Eidim Zomimim. It happens that they were caught out, so they get the reciprocal penalty of lashes, as well as another set of lashes for bearing false witness against their neighbor. So the nuanced difference between the two is the fact is that can we apply within the same punishment? In other words, it's both lashes, it to occur twice. 2 sets of 40, or is it 1 set of 40? That's a little bit different when you're saying there are two separate punishments, not from two different pasukim, that's Rabbi Meir, but in fact, when there is that case, do we apply the greater punishment or do we apply both? So they're slightly two different arguments there. So one of the issues that we have, guys, if you can just put yourself on mute, because I'm hearing for some reason my voice bouncing back and it's coming from your computer. Okay. So what are we saying here is the one of the issues is that we learn Kim Lepadi Rapimine, we pay the penalty greater than it. In other words, if you've got a death penalty case and a case of Makkos, which are lashes, the death penalty suffices to cover both a less and greater penalty. Kim Lepadi Rapimine is the case also where there is a case where you burn a Picasso on Shabbos with the right warning by the right witnesses, and in that case you don't get you don't have, your estate doesn't have to pay, nor you when you're alive before they apply the death penalty, the case of the monetary compensation, but only the death penalty which suffices to work as an atonement for both. The question that arose here is why should the sages say when there's a case of Makkos versus money, if we say there's one punishment, even according to the sages, why do they opt for payment instead of Makkos? Those were one of my questions. Do you see the question? If we have a law, Lance, which you weren't there for Sanhedrin and you weren't there for Bava Kama, that you pay the greater penalty, why would the greater penalty, which is money, which is lashes, not be made to pay? Why would we pay the money? Do you get it? That's one of the questions. One of the answers is that where the reciprocal penalty can be applied, that is your first priority. In other words, if the sages interpret it as the word harishato, which is a singular form of wickedness, and you can only apply one penalty, sorry, then we go with the monetary penalty simply because that's what they sought to do to the victim, according to Kasha Zomer. It was the first Tosfot that was discussed, and I discussed it with you, which Kevin amazingly sent that. So Kevin, a big thank you. In other words, he sent that free Tosfot, that free first one from the book, which means, according to Tosfot, there's two possible reasons. Is that either you pay a penalty of Makkos because Kasha Zomer in Adam Zomamim, when the normal punishment can't fit, you get lashes. And also, there was an argument in the Gemara of saying that for bearing false testimony, you get lashes. So Ula brought way back when, even in 2b, is that the lashes are there for transgressing both technically, except the rabbis would apply only one sort of penalty, which would cover kasha zome, which is the appropriate default application when you can't do the reciprocal punishment. When did we learn that? In the case with the Cohen, because we didn't want his children of the Adam Zomamim to suffer, even though he intended to do that to his victim, and their children didn't deserve the suffering either. The case here is that his child, as wicked as the Adam Zomamim are, do not deserve that punishment of being stripped of their Kohen status. And that was an issue that Lance brought up way back then. Do you remember, Lance? Okay. So we are saying then, why apply monetary payment instead of malchus? Because when it comes to kasha zomim, which is applying the reciprocal penalty, that takes precedence, according to most opinions, more than bearing false witness. Why? Because only Rabbi Meir and certain opinions say you apply two punishments. And if there is a punishment, we go with Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 19. We do to him what he intended to do to his brother. Meaning, if you intended to cost your brother 200 zuz and you found to be Adam Zomamim, you each have to pay the 100 zuz each as Adam Zomamim. And not lashes. Do you see why we apply monetary as opposed to lashes, guys? It fits. In other words, it's the default of a reciprocal penalty, only when that doesn't fit, because there are implications to the family directly losing their Cohen status or others that don't quite fit well, do we apply the lashes. Does that make sense? Where else do we see this? In Sanhedrin, where there's a daughter of a Bas Cohen, and we say what we intended to do to his brother, which is a different penalty, which is to what is applied to the daughter of a Bas Cohen. That's what they suffer when we can't apply both, even though it's the less stringent of the two, because the pasuk is very specific about what he did to his brother. Okay, so with that, let's just go into the Gemara, back to the Gemara in mind, and look at it with a bit of fresh eyes. And we say that, look, the sages, the rabbis, they say that you can't receive the hazama penalty and receive lashes as well. Why? Because if you look at Devarim, chapter 25, verse 2, which is Deuteronomy, we say that the Rishato, his wickedness is a singular form in the word, meaning you can't apply lashes and monetary payment. In other words, it bars the conjunction of both. How do you know? You can see this in Kesubos 32a that says that the reason that you pay money is because in this particular case, it is you sought to cost the defendant 200 zuz. So only Rabbi Meir says that you shall not bear false witness, and that's certainly suitable in this case. Okay, so we want to know what Rabbi Meir does with this. In other words, why does he not read the singular verse of wickedness? Why is he mandating two different punishments? So we know Rabbi Meir, what's the reason? Is that he said whenever you've got two different scriptural verses that both have to be applied, and that is thou shalt not bear false witness, which I read to you the source, as well as you shall do to him as you plan to do to his brother. So therefore he said it's not a singular form of wickedness, they're two different pasukim, and that they should each be adhered to. Okay, so this was another point at which initially is misunderstood. The Gemara, if you look at Schottenstein, says Ulla answers where Rabbi Meir derives his rule from a different verse. So when you're first reading it, it seems as though what? Ulla is defending whom? Rabbi Meir. And what we are saying is it's not the case. He's not defending Rabbi Meir. What the Gemara is doing is saying, look, at the end of the day, what's that snake with fur you've got there? Arth? Which cat's that? It's still alive, even from visiting Israel. It's got 9 lives, that cat. What we are saying is here, Lance, sorry, I was a bit distracted, is that it's not that Ul is coming to defend Rabbi Meir, rather that the Gemara is saying, look, you want to know why a monetary payment is chosen over Makkos. So the question then, Lance, becomes, is that surely if Rabbi Meir has got two stringencies, and he says this one pasuk gets Makkos and the other one gets payment, why do we apply the lesser one, even though it's more apt because what he sought to do to his brothers is done according to him? What is the broader category? The broader category for a false testimony is what? Is lashes. It's not in the microcosmic case of reciprocal penalty. What have you done? You've testified against falsely against your neighbor, yeah? So then the question that the Gemara is actually asking is twofold. Firstly, how can you apply two principles of Rabbi Meir, two punishments, even though this when it uses the form rishato of wickedness, which the rabbis use? And number two, why don't we make that person pay lashes? Because lashes would cover the less stringent form of punishment, which is the payment, as well as the more stringent form bearing false witness under the broader category. Do you see how the question comes up? If you can only apply one penalty, why not give lashes, and that would cover both? Because a default position is when you cannot apply the reciprocal penalty, we do lashes. So if you can only apply one form of wickedness, why not take the more stringent, and that would cover both pasukim? Do you understand the deeper question, guys, that the Gemara is asking? And it's not so clear superficially. And that reason is that we say that Ulla is there not to defend Rabbi Meir, but we're looking at a case of Ulla in order to give a possible reason. So Ulla answers that Rabbi Meir derives his rule from a different verse. What's that rule? One who defames his wife. So when you're looking at that, the father gets 100 silver pieces, silver shekels, because prior to being married, the girl lived at the father's house. She was in his legal custody. And where's that verse about defaming somebody's wife? It's in Devarim, chapter 22, verse 13 to 19. We also said the girl has to be in the first 6 months of puberty. And the husband claims fraudulently that in the Irus, in the betrothal period, she was having an adultery and trying to get her killed. Why does he want to get her killed when he can get divorced? Why do you think, guys? Guys, why do you think?
It costs less.
Cost less. Arthur's right. If you want to think like a criminal, ask Arthur. Arthur's a smart one.
That
Um,
depends which road we're looking at. It doesn't always cost less.
what are you talking about?
In this world, it costs less, but in the next world, it's costing you dearly. Trust
So
me.
Gavin's thinking of it Sadiq, but Gavin's right and Arthur's right. So that's why people do it and that's why people don't do it, Gav. Exactly. So the thing of it is we have to be particularly severe, and therefore there's two punishments. And that's why generally we say that one of the problems is that this is particularly stringent because you have to both receive lashes and pay. So the Gemara is saying, well, what comparison can be made to the defamer, which is a particularly stringent fine? And therefore it can't serve as a model for cases where it would be less stringent like Adam Zomomim. Okay? And then the Gemara's got a bit of a problem because it says Rabbi Meir holds exactly like Rabbi Akiva, who says that the punishment imposed on Zomomim witnesses is also fine. And that's comparable to the case of one who defames his wife, meaning that generally you can't learn a case of a mammon compensation from a fine. Why? Because it's easy to learn a case of compensation. If you damage me, whatever my car damages are, you have to replace the damage. And therefore, if the amount changes, the principle is the same. How do you learn the case of a fine to another case of compensation? Because a fine is particularly stringent. And we're saying maybe there's a stringency involved here. And we're saying that you can with the case of Adam Zomamim. And what are we trying to learn? Two things. Firstly, that there are, according to Rabbi Meir, there's a case of a Makkos and a penalty, two punishments, and one from each pasuk. According to the rabbis, we're learning that why would you end up paying the more stringent Makkos necessarily? But either way, Rabbi Akiva sees it as a fine. Kevin, why would it be a fine as opposed to a compensation? According to Rabbi Akiva.
According to Rabbi, so a compensation is making restitution. Am I on the right track?
Only you would know. You explaining it to us.
Well, I didn't have. I've been following somewhat. So a fine is like it's a penalty for the transgression. It's not It's not making restitution.
Okay. Okay, can Brendan, you wanted to say something?
No, I had the same thought, or that last part.
No, well, the truth of it is, why are you saying it's a fine and not compensation? Because Rabbi Akiva is saying something simple, and this is the answer I wanted from you guys. Listen, at the end of the day, did the defendant have to pay over the money, yes or no? Yes or no?
The answer is no, sorry.
Okay, now why, Gavin?
Because he didn't pay, because he wasn't, that's why Rabbi Akiva says it's a penalty, because of the fact that you haven't paid over anything. He didn't pay over anything because the case hasn't been won or lost. It's like sitting in limbo type of thing.
Be a little bit more specific.
I'm so zoned out. That's why I know what it is. So the verdict hasn't been. So the verdict, the verdict. I think. Remember, the verdict and the and the actual implementation of the verdict, whatever you call that, it's the same thing, right? So I don't know if it's in between that period. Sorry, I'm just battling to focus. But I know it's like that. It's either the verdict hasn't taken place or the verdict's taken place, but they haven't actually implemented or the judgment's taken place, but they haven't actually implemented anything yet.
I'll take that as a correct answer.
They haven't
So,
carried it out.
correct.
They haven't carried it out yet.
Correct. So sentencing hasn't been carried out. And this is exactly why the Adam Zomamim have to pay. Because if before the verdict was given, the Adam Zomamim were caught out by the second set of witnesses that said the first set were not there to be able to have witnessed the crime, then the case is thrown out of court. The only reason why the reciprocal penalty is given to the first set of witnesses is because verdict has already been given, but sentencing hasn't. And that's why they're made to pay the reciprocal penalty, because if the sentencing was given out, the Adam Zomamim do not suffer in this world and are made to pay the reciprocal penalty. They suffer in the next world. They don't get the kapora and the opportunity to suffer in this world. And if it's before the verdict is given, then there's no verdict given, so the Adam Zomamim's case is thrown out of court, but they do not get the reciprocal penalty. It has to be in that sweet spot before sentencing is carried out, after verdict is given. That's when the Adam Zomamim are punished in this world. Okay, exactly as Gavin said. So I'll take that. And the reason why Rabbi Akiva is saying it's a penalty is because it hasn't actually cost the defendant any money, because verdict sentence was not handed over. We had to hand over his money. The verdict was given, but sentence wasn't. And therefore, it's not compensation for monetary loss. It's a pure bonus. Yes, there was stress, a lot of stress, but that's considered a kanas, a penalty, because the money wasn't handed over. So it's not compensation for losses. Okay? Why do the rabbis see it as different, Lance?
Why do they see it differently to Rabbi Akiva?
Yeah, why do they see it as compensation?
He's saying it's a penalty. So he's saying it's a penalty, and they're saying it's not a penalty.
They're saying it's a mammon compensation, and he's saying it's a kanas, a penalty. Why do the rabbis see it as different? Well, firstly, why does Rabbi Akiva sees it as a penalty? Because it didn't really cost the defendant money, because the sentence wasn't passed yet, which is the only reason why the Adam Zomamim are punished. If sentence is passed, once it's done, we can't punish the Adam Zomamim. They only suffer in the next world. They don't get the opportunity to suffer in this world. So we understand why Rabbi Akiva sees it as a penalty. It didn't cost the defendant money. Money wasn't transferred over yet. Sentencing wasn't given, only the verdict. So actually you can understand Rabbi Akiva more than the rabbis from logic. How did the rabbis see it as mammon, compensation?
What's the time frame for after the verdict that they'll implement the punishment?
It doesn't matter, whatever it is. The concept is whether it's a day or two, whatever the case may be. The bottom line of it is, did the defendant actually lose money here, Brendan? Yes or no?
I'd say yes.
No, absolutely not. Because when the verdict was given, that because at that stage, the second set of witnesses hadn't come past yet. So the verdict is, yes, you have to pay over, because we believe that those first set of witnesses, it's only when a second set come past and say, they're not disputing the facts of the case. When there are two conflicting sets of witnesses, the case is thrown out of course, because we don't know whether to believe the second or first set. But here, with Adam Zomamim, it's a unique principle from Moshe at Har Sinai, that they're not calling into question the facts of the case. They're saying the first set couldn't have witnessed the case in Santon because they were with the second set of witnesses in Plettenberg Bay. So the character of the witnesses is found to be conspiratory, and therefore they get the reciprocal penalty. Because what should happen is they should cancel each other out. This law from Moshe at Har Sinai, when the integrity is brought forward, that they weren't in that location, they are conspiring, and they're much more vindictive than false witnesses. False witnesses are merely disputing the facts of the case, because we said a guy maybe committed an affair in a hotel room and doesn't want to kind of lose the wife and kids in terms of custody and half his asset base. But he's not saying, he was at a place where he wasn't. So conspiring witnesses, we believe the second set from Moshe Har Sinai. So Brendan, no money was handed over, technically.
I see.
Because Lance, hang on one sec. If it had, then at that point, there's nothing you can do. The sentence has been passed. If you execute in a case of an execution, that innocent defendant, we don't apply the Adam Zimmerman punishment. Do you see that? That's one of the tenets. Why? Because they don't deserve kapora or atonement in this world. They're going to face the full music in the next world. And also, for whatever reason, the case was allowed to pass through Mina Shemaim, through divine providence, and therefore we can't undo it. And the Adam Zimmerman don't get the mercy because they're conspiring. They don't get punished in this world because they corrupted the justice system. But further to which, the case has already gone through, so we don't try them once sentencing has been passed. Only in that in-between stage between verdict and sentencing. Lance, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that, look, I would agree with Rabbi Akiva that it's more like a punishment because they wouldn't be out of pocket. But where the rabbis could be correct is that you're basically defaming them. You've accused them, and you've tried to defame them. And based on that, I'd say it's a compensation. That's compensation based on the fact that it was defaming him as opposed to actually, they didn't actually cost money, but they just lost their reputation.
Okay, so Lance is bringing a good point in that in secular law, you can sully a person's reputation, and therefore it's compensation for the stress that's caused and to defame a person's reputation. Is that what you're saying, Lance?
Yeah.
So I would agree that the stress level is unbelievable. The reason the Gemara gives is something slightly different, is that the Gemara doesn't discern between the verdict and the sentencing. It's one legal, oh God, sorry, guys. It's actually one process. Only in secular law, when we're living in such a corrupt society, where people are not scared to use Hashem's name in vain, and there are no extenuating circumstances like, Lance, you've got what you call somebody that breaks the law 3 times. What is that called in American law? I've gone blank. My blood sugar's low. But it's a habitual offender, basically. So he's got a track record of a chazaka. In other words, he then gets given, if he's got a deferred sentence where he's on probation, he gets that other sentence also, as well as the new sentence, because he's a habitual offender. So the probation falls away, and it says probation of imprisonment for 3 years, should there be another offense. So you've got that, you've got federal offenses and a myriad of other things. And so what happens in secular law is the difference between a guilty pronouncement and a sentence, because of the complexity of the cases that have come, if you're living in a society that's rife with crime. In this particular case, there is a set punishment for a set sentence, and therefore verdict and sentencing is just a matter of time period. And what that allows us to do is to have almost a bit of breathing last minute to basically exonerate the defendant, especially in death penalty cases. They look at every single reason to not give somebody a death penalty. We learned it in Sanhedrin. We're learning it in Makkos with Rav Simcha Steinhauer in the 7th Daf, etc. So what we are saying is, Lance, the reason is slightly different. And I agree with you for all those reasons of stress and trauma and reputational damage. But the reason the Gemara says is quite simply, is the reason it's compensation is the point where the verdict goes against the defendant. You have cost him because the verdict was given. You only haven't sentenced him, but you have actually cost him by law because at that point, your verdict against this person has caused him to suffer that consequence. It might not be meted out, because thank God a second set of witnesses has turned around and said the first set were not in that location. But in principle, by law, you in fact have cost him that money. It might not have been carried out yet, but it's in fact the law sees it as having done the damage. Do you get what I'm saying, Lance?
Actually, yes, it's actually just compensation for stress then, because they haven't physically paid the money, but they have to stress. They have to find that they start looking for the money. They haven't paid it yet, but they've been in the process of getting it.
No, so the Gemara doesn't answer like that. I'm actually agreeing with you that in fact there is defamation of character, there is stress, especially the death sentence. I can't even imagine what that would be. But the person hasn't been killed yet, etc. But the reason that it's compensation is according to the rabbis, they see it as measure for measure. Whatever the verdict is at what you actually had sentenced against this person, even though the sentence wasn't carried out, is done to you. So if it's a death penalty, it's done to the Eidim Zomimim. If it's lashes, it's done to them. If it's monetary costing, it's done to them. So in other words, it's compensation matching exactly the verdict that was given to this defendant. The fact that it wasn't carried out is a separate issue. So they see it as compensation because a kanas, a penalty, usually has three characteristics, Lance. Number one is that of your own volition, when you admit it, you only have to pay the compensatory amount. You don't have to pay the penalty. Number two, it's a fixed amount. And here it's not fixed. It's basically can vary from death penalty to lashes, corporal punishment to monetary, but it matches in compensation exactly what you intended to do to the victim, and where your verdict was successfully taken against the defendant is done to you. And therefore, it might not have been carried out yet, but it is compensatory. In other words, the verdict is just reversed upon you. Do you get what I'm saying? It's not, yeah? That's what the Gemara says.
Quick question. So there should be two penalties. There should be compensation. There should be the financial restitution, and there should be lashes. But they say we normally go with a stricter, but yeah, you've been lenient. If you haven't got the money, do they then? If you haven't got the money, so you try to cost the guy damage of 100,000, 200,000. You haven't got the money. Can you then get lashes, or do you get sold into slavery, or to that person, or what happens then?
That's an excellent point, and that was addressed initially in the first Gemara. In the third daf, and in the third daf it discussed this case of initially we thought that if you know the defendant doesn't have the money, but you have the money, why should you go into slavery? Because this is exactly where that issue was brought up, saying, look, all I intended to do is have the verdict place that he shall make restitution on what he stole. Therefore, why should I go into slavery? Because he doesn't have the money. The fact that he doesn't have the money is not what I intended to do to him. I intended him to pay money. The fact that he doesn't have the money is a separate issue. So that's going on the case of compensation. This is where the issue was first addressed, where then the response was, yeah, but in fact, we can hold that you knew the guy didn't have the money, so your intention wasn't about the verdict, it was about intention, and therefore you should go into slavery. Do you get what I'm saying? This is exactly where it first came out. Lance has got a good memory. And then the issue was, but what happens if the defendants don't have the money, but the Eidim Zomimim don't have the money, but the defendant did? So then the verdict was he should pay, and the intent also was that they won't enslave him. But why should they be enslaved? Because they intended this person just to pay. They knew he was a rich guy. They didn't intend him to go into slavery. And then they say, well, why should we go into slavery? And they should, according to the fact of it, is the verdict is you have to pay. And since you can't pay as Adam Zomabim, we're putting you into slavery. But no, that wasn't the intent. So now we've got a problem. Isn't on intent or verdict. And the answer is we only give them reciprocal slavery in the case where both the defendant doesn't have money nor the Adam Zomabim have money. If either party has money, the default position is exactly as Lance said, that if they both have money, then money is the option. If one party doesn't have money, then we set a defaulter to lashes, Lance. It's exactly the great point that Lance brought. All right, guys, that was brilliant, but we're going to go through the complexities of the case of multiple versus singular punishment and why we pay the lesser penalty of money as opposed to the broader thing of not bearing false witness. Why the subcategory? All right, guys, I hope that helped. We're going to go into it more in depth.
Well,
Yes.
thank you.
Cheers.
Thank